Our guest today is Assemblyman Bill Quirk, who's represented the East Bay in the legislature for more than 8 years. Thanks for speaking with me today, Assemblyman Quirk.
Great to be here. So I'll be speaking with the students of Castro Valley High today.
What do you think are the next steps that we should take regarding COVID?
Well, the big thing is to get everybody vaccinated. And I think I'm not so worried about the people who are anti-vaxxers because there's not a lot of them. My concern is the people who just aren't going to get around to it. So I think what we have to do, and this was done in polio as well, is go out to where people live and work and study. In the case of Castro Valley High, I think it'd be great to bring the vaccine to the high school as soon as it's okayed for people 12 and up, and Pfizer is very close to that right now. I would love to just, bring it to the high school, get everybody vaccinated, and open like normal come the fall.
How can the government encourage people to take the vaccine?
Well, there's two things. One is just answering everyone's questions to the extent you can. The other is working with doctors because people tend to trust their own doctor. And so working with the medical association to have them reaching out to their members to encourage all of their patients to be vaccinated. We need that personal touch in addition to just answering people's questions and making it convenient for them. The more convenient, the better.
What has President Biden done so far in office that you think is significant?
With regard to COVID or generally?
Generally, or COVID?
Okay. Well, with regard to COVID, he's really funding the distribution well, which is critical. He's also helping out the state. We're going to have to help out a lot of people who aren't able to pay their rent and mortgages. And because of the resources we have from the federal government, I believe we're going to be able to do a lot of that. The last thing we need is people out on the street at this point. Also, it allows the state government, with the funds we have, to help out local businesses. So he is empowering the state to do what I think really needs to be done, both in terms of vaccination and in terms of getting people housed and in terms of getting people's back to business.
What would you like to see him do next?
Well, I think his infrastructure bill makes a lot of sense, and I agree with his more all-encompassing discussion of infrastructure. It's not just roads and bridges. It includes, and of course, transit, but it's beyond that. It's having, well, at this point, a whole lot of seniors who need help, and we need to get our schools back on track. I believe there's money there for summer school. So, as I said, infrastructure means, frankly, making sure that we don't have another generation of kids raised in poverty, which is a major emphasis of his infrastructure bill.
Recently, the Derek Chauvin verdict was announced. What did you think of the verdict?
It was just, thank God. It is very hard to convict police officers. The worst example I know of is the one in Baltimore, where they had someone in a van and they decided to give him a rough ride back to headquarters. And he had his neck broken when they gave him that rough ride and he died. And yet those officers were acquitted. So frankly, if this had happened, say 30 years ago, around, say in the 1980s sometime, without that film showing how long he had had his knee on the neck, it would have been very hard. Now, California has a different basis for officers. The criteria is different in that we say that if they're using force, it has to be necessary. And that's very different than the criteria at most other states and the national level, where it's, well, if you were a reasonable person, would you have been in fear of your life and therefore you would have used this level of force, or in fear for the lives of others? We say, yeah, that can be part of it, but it also just has to be necessary. And that's something that we've passed here in California. The Alameda County District Attorney, who of course oversees Castro Valley as well, is prosecuting an officer who, when someone came at him with a baseball bat, he shot him. And the DA doesn't feel that level of force was necessary, and so they're prosecuting that officer. In another state, they would have said, well, the officer's scared, he could have been hit by a bat, and the DA will say, well, he might have been scared, but was that necessary? And we don't think it was, and therefore we're charging him with, I believe it's second-degree murder, but I'm not positive. But at any rate, it's very important that we have these laws. So, and it's also important how much we train our officers. Quite often in training, there's too much of an emphasis on, if you don't act quickly, you'll be killed. In fact, police officers are murdered less likely than the average male is. So while it is certainly a dangerous profession, it's mostly people are killed by traffic accidents. When you go to the memorials for officers, I remember being there one year and there were 4 officers, they'd all been killed in traffic accidents. So what you've got to do is train them to think ahead of time. So for example, there's the famous case where someone fell asleep in the McDonald's line and the officer came up and they knew that the guy had a gun, and the officers came to wake him up and he reached for his gun and then he was shot to death. The training for that now is don't go near that guy. Stay off at a distance, use a loudspeaker to wake him up, tell him to come out without his gun or to drop it, and so where they can see it, and then nobody gets hurt. So, you know, a lot of it is thinking ahead of time. Now, this officer who was attacked by somebody from a baseball bat, and let me say, it'll be up to a jury to decide whether the DA's charge is correct or not. But he arrived on the scene and shot within a few seconds, and that's typical of the kind of violence that happens. It's people arriving on a scene and then within a few seconds making a quick decision. So what we're trying to train our officers to do is think before they arrive, stay out of distance so that they don't feel that they're going to be threatened. So it's a whole lot of it is training, and training them that, you know, while it does happen that they get shot by bad guys, you know, you want to put yourself where you're not in that situation, where you're not in fear for your life, so you can react in a way that doesn't bring on more violence. And that training is also extremely important. So yes, Derek Chauvin, I believe that was a just settlement. Again, I wasn't on the jury, but they heard weeks of testimony. They saw what happened from a number of different angles. And I believe they did come up with a just verdict. And I think a very important one. I think it would have really hurt the country if it had gone the other way.
What do you think should happen next concerning civil rights?
Well, I think the most important thing in civil rights is voting rights, and we have a whole bunch of states trying to make it harder to vote for no reason other than they're trying to keep down the Democratic vote and figuring that the Republicans, who on average are better educated, will come to the polls anyway. And arranging to make sure that in areas that have Democratic votes that there aren't enough voting machines, et cetera. I thought this was settled in the 60s and 70s, but apparently not. And it's due to the Supreme Court. And they were claiming that, oh, well, things have changed. We don't need this pre-approval, blah, blah. Well, we did. And the Supreme Court is a pro-Republican court. I hate to say it, but everything they do helps Republicans. They help them by not only through making it easier to have unfair, unjust laws, but also by making it easier for them to raise money and getting rid of limits on campaign spending. So it's a Republican court. Until that's changed, I'm really concerned about our civil rights, period.
Something very important in the news recently has been the recall. What do you think about the Governor Newsom recall effort?
It was a big mistake by the Republicans. The recall isn't going to occur until late October, early November. And the governor's going to raise a lot of money. And the governor is going to defeat the recall. And he's going to be more popular than ever. And we'll be out of the COVID-19. And, you know, they can do as many ads as they want that he had dinner at a restaurant when, by the way, he did have that dinner legally, but it certainly wasn't a good example. He was within the law for what they were doing, but frankly, I think it was a little bit dangerous. And again, it wasn't a good example, but that's basically what they're trying to indict him on. And then they're claiming he isn't getting people back to classes soon enough. In fact, in this state, there are a lot of parents who are concerned about whether or not their kids should go back to school yet. So there's not a consensus, but I think what there is a consensus on is we all have to get vaccinated, particularly high schoolers and middle schoolers. And the sooner we do that, the sooner we can all feel safe.
What do you think about the idea of tuition-free college?
Yes. I have friends who are actually, I'm 75, I have some friends who are 85. They went to Berkeley when it was basically free. It was like $25 a year in fees. And to be able to go to college and not be saddled with debt or with your parents, in my case, I was able to send my kids and it wasn't a big deal for me, but it is for a lot of parents and for a lot of children, and they shouldn't be saddled with that kind of debt. And we need our folks to be better educated so they can take on the jobs of the 21st century. So it's just, we need people. We need them to be educated.
And then our last question, what are you most proud of achieving in office?
Well, there are two bills I really think a lot about. Well, maybe 3, 4. Well, I'll go through a couple. One of them was, so when you're driving, the law used to be you couldn't hold your cell phone in your hand to talk or to text. And the problem was that someone could say, oh, I wasn't texting, I was looking at my map. Well, now you just can't hold your cell phone in your hand, period. And I'm willing to bet that that saves lives every year. And that was something brought to me by one of my legislative aides, and I was smart enough to listen to him. And it was tough. It was tough getting it passed because I can assure you the legislators are all distracted drivers who like to make calls. But at any rate, we did get it through, thanks in part to that aid. And another one was that I've made it easier to permit cell phone apparatus, cell phone towers. We're working on something to make 5G come out faster. So that's important. And then I worked with my chief of staff on a bill to protect women who had, what's the word for the stay away orders?
Restraining orders?
Restraining orders, yes. That if someone was asking for a restraining order, that the judge would have to say, if they couldn't grant it, why, allow for easier renewals, just to protect people. So those are three of the things that I'm extremely proud of. Oh, and then one thing. So motorcyclists in California, there was no law about whether or not they could go between cars. Because there was no law, it was legal. Because it was legal, they were doing it. But there couldn't be any enforcement because it wasn't recognized under the law. So with a lot of help from my legislative aides, I passed a law that says, yes, it is legal and it can be, you can send out guidelines on how to do it legally. I wanted to also have regulations, but the CHP didn't want that. They just wanted guidelines. I think it should have had regulations, but at any rate, it was a very interesting time and I met some fascinating people.
Thank you so much for talking with us today. We really appreciate your time.
All right. That was great talking to you too.
This has been Jeanette Wallis from the Castro Valley High School Olympian.